Good morning. With the help of Hashem, we are learning Yerushalmi Chala, Perek Aleph, Halacha Dalid, and Halacha Hey. We're learning today Daf Yud Dalid. We left off on Daf Yud Dalid, Amid Aleph, by the dot, 3 lines from the top of the Amid, and we're dedicating this class to Refuah Shlema to Michal ben Nechama Dina. Now, we just finished learning in the Mishnah, and as the Gemara explained the Mishnah properly, that both in the case of Me'isa and by the case of Chalita, we are referring to a certain way that they would prepare flour / bread, a dish made out of the grains, that first they would scald the flour with water. Me'isa would mean they would pour the hot water on the flour. Chalita would mean that they would put the flour into the boiling hot water. And at that step, the flour becomes cooked and edible. But from there, the person would go and they would take step number 2, a final step, which up until now we were discussing, is that they would put it into the oven. And the question is, do we view this as an item that's being cooked, for which there's no chiyuv of challah, right? It's not lechem. Do we view this as lechem, as an item that's being baked? Yes, chayiv and challah. Obviously, we're speaking about someone who has the minimum shear, that's bechlal chayiv and challah. And we had Beis Shammai, Beis Hillel. And as we understood it, there is a machlokes who said what. Either Beis Shammai says always pater, or Beis Hillel was the one that always said pater. Now, at Khan, these two opinions did not differentiate in greater detail as is what step 2. That was never discussed. It's no difference. Now, the Gemara is going to bring from a Braisa a third opinion regarding both Me'isa and Chalita, that we have to know what will be the final step, whether they're going to put it in an oven. And we already interpreted that the halachic definition of an oven is when the fire is on the side of the dough, or whether they plan to put it in a pot or in a frying pan, and we're having the fire directly underneath it. That will be consequential. And also, furthermore, what is the kavana while they are scalding it? That's also something that was not discussed until now. In other words, the Gemara will point out that there will be a difference whether when you scalded it, did you have in mind then to eat it, just scald it, or while you scalded it, you also already had in mind to go into a step number 2. That will be of great consequence. And the Gemara then is going to close up Halacha Dalid by referring back to the last case of Halacha Dalid, where a person is preparing either Chalois Toida or the Kikei Nazir. And the Gemara differentiated, the Mishnah differentiated that if the person is baking these items for his own carbon, then he's going to be exempt from removing challah. If the person is baking them to sell it to other people that are going to be chayiv to bring this as part of their carbon, then they're going to be chayiv in challah. And the Gemara is going to explain why. And it's the way, beautifully, the way the Rabbi Yochanan was Mesader, the Yerushalmi, the logic behind the difference will help us understand Halacha Hey. Now, Halacha Hey is a topic that we touched upon some point. I know we're only 2 weeks into it, 14 daf into it. But what we did touch upon is that when a person needs a dough, and the dough has the minimum shear, but they intend as dough to break them into very small pieces. I mentioned the story of a woman that she prepared a dough for her son's birthday party, and that was the kavana from the outset, and she divided her dough into 30-some pieces to give it to every little child to take it home and to make chal at home. Even though when the dough was needed, you had the minimum shear, since the kavana was to break that into small pieces prior to baking, you are exempt from removing challah. That's the premise, that's the base of halacha hey. But the halacha hey will differentiate various cases. In some cases, taka, the way we explained, you'll be potter. But then the Mishnah gives a case as an example that you have a baker. A baker is preparing sourdough. What I mean by sourdough is sa'ir. Sa'ir could be used by people to help their other larger doughs ferment quicker. So the baker is preparing sourdough with the intent of breaking them into small little sa'ir pieces, selling them to clients who only sourdough to begin with. Sa'ir, which is really a starter, is not something that people buy in larger quantities. People buy them in small quantities. His intent, lachatchila, was to divide it into small pieces and to sell to every client a little piece of the sa'ir. You would think, since this was intention when he needed it to break it apart and to sell it, you would think he would be exempt. Theoretically, you're right. The Mishnah is going to say that you're going to be chayiv. That will be an exception to the rule, as the Gemara will explain the reason for that. Now, what the Gemara will bring, the Mishnah will go into many other pratim, as we'll see, but the big sugya on Daf Yud Dalid Amid Beis is a machlokes between Rabbi Yochanan and Eish Lakish that we already had, probably in Masechtas Maasros. I think we had this for sure once, maybe already twice, and that is the following. As we spoke out so many times, that when is produce triggered to the point where it's called tevel, you can't even snack from it. You're chayiv to be toidem u'ma'aser from when it became a final product, from when it undergoes its gemar melacha. By grain, the gemar melacha is smoothing the pile on the threshing floor. Mei ruach. There's a machlokes Amoraim, Rabbi Yochanan and Eish Lakish. What happens if I am going to smooth your pile of grain without your consent, without your knowledge? Is when we say that the gemar melacha triggers tevel, and now you're chayiv to be toidem u'ma'aser. Is it the act of meruach? It happened. The item is completed, which is indeed shitas Rabbi Yochanan, who says that hamimoreach kiryoy shel chaveroi sheloi midatoi. Rabbi Yochanan says, even though it was done without the other's consent or knowledge, nitbal, it becomes tevel. Reish Lakish holds that meruach is not only about the act of smoothing of the pile, but it's about the kavana, the knowledge, the desire of. And therefore, if I do it for you, of course, if you ask me to, I'm like your shliach. I don't even need shlichus. I had your das. But if I did it, shaloi midatoi, interestingly, Reish Lakish holds that loy nitbal. And we're going to see how the Gemara is going to bring that machlokes and challenge it from a detail that we'll have in our Mishnah. We're going to also, just a final topic, we learned this in Masechta Maasros. What happens if you have an ant hole? In Brazil, you have these mountains. It was a whole neighborhood of ants right near a pile of grain that underwent meruach. And it's far away, but there is also in the vicinity a pile of grain that did not yet undergo the meruach. The big difference between them is that from the one that did not yet have gemar melacha, you can snack from, and from the one that had gemar melacha, you can't even snack from. You go ahead in the ant hole and you find little grains. Are you allowed to eat it? And the Mishnah gives the rule that we presume halachically that the ants took the grain from the nearby pile, not from the faraway pile. And if the nearby pile underwent the meruach, then we have to presume that the grains that you find in the ant hole are already nitbal, and you can't even snack from them. And again, we're going to bring that Mishnah to challenge, we'll see, Shitas Rabbi Yochanan that holds that hamimoreach kiryoy shel chaveroi nitbal, or nitbal, as we'll explain when we learn the Gemara inside. It's going to be fascinating. Daf Yud Dalid, Amud Aleph, 3 lines from the top. So Atkan, again, going back to the case of Meisa and Chalita, that all we have is either they're both going to be chayiv, or they're both going to be pater. I know machlokes Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, machlokes what they both say, and they say the same in both cases. The Chachamim, the Gemara begins by quoting a brayso that there's a Chachamim that say, before they say what they say what they don't say. That loy kedivrei zeh, v'loy kedivrei zeh. Not like Beis Shammai, not like Beis Hillel, not your chayiv or pater. It's not enough. What's the din of meisa? That's many times people ask a shaila, Aviv, you can't answer until you find out more information. More information is needed, and that is Ella. If this flour, after it underwent its scalding, which halachically is considered cooking, which is an item which will exempt the 5 grains from challah. But if later hanefa betanur, if it was baked in an oven is defined by where the fire is on the side of the dough, then chayiv. Period. In other words, I don't care if it was edible as cooked, since now it's baked, let's go with that. Baked is chayiv. Baked before you put it into the oven, since it's going to go into an oven. But if the plan of taking these scalded flours is to later, in step number 2, put it either in an ilfas, which is a frying pan, or in a kedera, or in a pot, and dafka where there is no water, dafka where you're not deep frying it, and furthermore, as we learned, I think it was the last daf or 2 daf ago, where the fire was underneath it, the way we put a pan on the fire, the way we put a pot on the fire, so the fire is underneath it. And don't get confused, whoever missed that daf, I know that in today's oven, in my oven, there's fire underneath. Doesn't work that way. Chazal define an oven as where the fire is on the side, because they would stick the doughs on the walls of the oven. Verstehst? So since this is not the way this Braisa understands, that's not called an act of baking. Why is that? Because the fire is underneath it. That's why, and only there it's going to be pater. Whether it's meisa, whether it's chalit. That's gavaldik. That's the Braisa.
So, now, Rabbi, just a quick question. Therefore, in today's ovens, it's pater?
I would say to Vlad, I'm saying theoretically, okay, but let's go, we're not learning Shulchan Aruch, that just like when it comes to other areas in the Torah, nishtanu, certain things are defined by the way people do things. It affects halacha, right? You can't cross-dress. Not a lot of cross-dress. How do you define a beged of a man or a beged of a woman? It's not so black and white. Right? A person lives in Scotland, a man can wear a skirt. I'm saying this all theoretically. And you cannot say that a woman who wears pants today is violating it. You can't say that. You don't find, other than in the Fruma community, all of the women are wearing pants. In other words, the definition of something has to do with common practice. And therefore, I think, Vlad, that since nowadays the ovens are where fire is underneath it, so we don't use that anymore as a definition. Okay. But let's leave that theoretically. Now, the Gemara says,
would bagels fall into this category, because they're boiled?
I wish I knew, because I wish I knew, Danny. I don't know how to make bagels. Maybe you know how to make bagels. So how do you make bagels?
They take a dough. First, they throw it into boiling water, which is the same idea of scalding it. Yes. And then afterwards, it's baked in an oven.
So that's
literally clear. What it is.
According to our Gemara, according to the Chachamim, and let me add with what Vlad said, I don't care if the fire is under or not. If that, and we'll see in the moment, and that's the kavana. We knew that's going to happen. You're chayiv. Now, ezu chalut, the Gemara just wants to clarify. Ezu chalut barur. What's the case of absolute scalding? So there is something called absolute scalding. Absolute scalding, I want to go back to your bagels, which even according to this Braisa, Danny, even if you put it into an oven, it was so scalded. This is important, this piece, Danny, for you, Mamish. Even if you're going to put it into an oven, you're going to be pater. There is such a thing. And where is that? The Mishnah said chalita. So the Gemara understands that our Mishnah is speaking about you putting flour in a pot of boiling water, but you did it when the pot of water is already off the fire. So the water is not boiling or bubbling. So since it's not chalut barur, and therefore the next step of baking has some added real benefit, therefore you chayiv and challah. But if it was so cooked, that's called chalut barur. And what is that? That you put the flour into a pot of boiling water when the pot of water is on the fire, then according to Rab Ze'era, even if you put it later in an oven, you're going to be pater from taking challah. I'm assuming that's how they make bagels. I don't believe they make bagels without having the pot over the fire. But the
pot is definitely on the fire when they make bagels.
Here you go. Here we go. So now
the only thing I'm thinking about is with bagels, it's the dough is being scalded, if you want to use that word. Whereas it seems like what we're learning, it's about the flour.
I don't think there's a difference. I don't think there's a difference. I think it has to do whether the product is fully edible because it was cooked. So even though you now decided to put it into the oven, according to Rab Ze'era, you're going to be pater. Amar Rabbi Yosi, no, I disagree with you. Afilu ha'ur mahalach tachtov. Even if you put flour into a pot that's on the fire, so it's mamish, cooked, bishul gamor, mekivin shu asad la soy soy, since you plan, the kavana, lechatchila was that you plan later to make it into a a dough again. However, because like you said, the flour was thrown into the water. Then they're going to mix it. Then they're going to put it into the oven. That's the last soy. Since you plan lachatchila to put it into the oven, you're going to be chayiv and chala. No, according to Rabbi Yossi, it's about your kavana of what will be the final step. And even if prior to the final step, it's fully edible, as cooked, you're chayiv and chala. So the answer to your question, Danny, I don't know, is whether we paskin like Rab Ze'era, whether we paskin like Rabbi Yossi. Says the Gemara weiter, Abraisa, kemach koli, sho asoi batzek. So you have roasted kernels of wheat, and while they were still moist, right, you roasted them. You have kernels. While they're moist, you roast them. Then you ground them into flour. That was a certain way. And then they would take that flour and they would mix it with honey. And because of it being roasted, just for the record, that was already edible without cooking and without baking. It's already edible. So if, again, your kavana is not to eat it like that, but to mix it with water and to put it into the oven, kelach koli shu asoi batzek, you made it into a dough. You made it into a dough because you plan to put it into the oven. Then you're going to be chayiv b'chala, which is, by the way, very similar to Rabbi Yossi. Doesn't matter if it's fully edible prior to the baking part. If that was your intent, this is called a baked product. Rabbi Yossi b'shem Rabbi Yechanan advohu sha'afayon. Yeah, shkoyach. When do you say kelach koli shasoi batzek? You're chayiv if you lechatchila had kavana to put it into the oven, like Rabbi Yossi. Mashe'en kain, if you had these kernels and you roasted them and you mixed the flour and then you made them into flour, okay? Then you mix it with honey, and while you made it up until this point, you did not plan to put it into the oven. Even according to Rabbi Yossi, even according to this Braisa, if you change your mind, you'll be exempt. That's important. In other words, what is your kavana at the outside? Very consequential, because you're dealing with a product that's fully edible prior to it being baked. It's only when you had lechatchila kavana to bake it are you chayiv and chala. If you would see Aviv's look, you need coffee. It's very simple. In Brazil, they say coffee helps you grow. I had an aunt that would put coffee in the baby bottles for my cousins. All right. Now the final part of the Mishnah. Chalois toida, right? Which is, so you're baking. Someone went ahead and they prepared all the way to the baking. Either the chalas that a toida has to bring, or urekike nazir. Toida has to bring 4 types of chalois. A nazir has to bring 2 types from each group, 10. That means a nazir brings 20. A person who brings a carbon toida brings 40. So the Mishnah says like this, that if the person was baking them for himself, in other words, let's say, I'm chayiv a toida, I'm going to bring a toida, I prepared it, I made the doughs, I put it into the oven, then I'm potter. We said in the Mishnah the reason already, because hegdish is exempt from. So it's a hegdish. But if a person was baking them to sell it to other nizirim, or to other people that are chayiv and toida, for some reason the Mishnah says, then the baker is chayiv. And the question will be why. So before we go on as to the case of chiyuv, the Gemara now goes, why are you potter? And the answer is because the chsiv, it says, reishis adisoy seichem, and the limud is from the yours, right? The first of your doughs, only if it belongs to you, v'loy shel hegdish. But now going back to the Mishnah, if the person prepared these breads properly, but it was limkar b'shug, then you're chayiv. And the question is, why are you chayiv? It's hegdish. What's the difference? So the Gemara says, beautiful. Because loy bedatoy hadavar toloi. Will it actually be used for a carbon? If you plan to sell it, it's not fully up to you. Taka, you had that as your intent. But so what? Now, the Yerushalmi's version is, bedas halakuchais, B'das halakuchais hadavar taloi. So far, Bavli Yerushalmi is the same. It's up to the buyers. Our version is Shema yimtza halakuchais. You might find buyers. Now you have to add words who plan to eat it for their dinner. In other words, when you plan to sell something, you know what will actually happen. It's up to the client. And if a client comes, if a customer comes, and they don't want to buy it for hegdish, they're not chayiv to bring a toida, or the chayiv, they're going to buy their chalois toida from someone else. then don't forget, you were not magdish it yet. Your intent was for it to be used. You made it kil chasa, which is complicated. You sifted it 13 times. Most people wouldn't use such expensive breads for their own personal, but could be someone would. That's the version in the Yerushalmi. Shema yimtza lakucha is that plan to eat it for themselves. So therefore, v'nitbulu miyad, they become tevel the moment you needed it. Just to know that in the Bavli, the words in the Gemara is Shema lo yimtza lakucha. You might not find any customers. What happens if you make something aviv and you don't find customers? So that's what my father told me. If you're in the food business, it's not the end of the world because then you can eat it. He complained that his merchandise you can't eat. You have to sell it. In other words, if you won't, that's the gears in the Bavli. Shema lo yimtza lakuchais. You won't find purchasers, and now you're going to end up eating it. In other words, since anything that's commercialized is something that's already known that we don't know what ultimately will happen with it. Because it's being commercialized, you plan to sell it. You don't know whether you're going to find a customer. You don't know for what the customer will want to use it for. Masha Enkein, back in the Mishnah, that if asan la'atzmai, then your kavana is consequential. Since I plan to eat it for myself, it's already in the category of hegdish, even if you were not magdish it yet. It's already excluded from the reishis arisoi sechem, and therefore you're going to be pater. Okay, atkan halacha dalit, and now chevra freilach, we are beginning the new Mishnah. Halacha hey, as we mentioned before, that you're only chayiv challah when the dough has a minimum share of, let's go, 43.2 eggs. Let's go with the 5 pounds. Furthermore, if I needed the dough with 5 pounds of flour, but my intent from the outset was prior to baking it to separate this dough into parts and to bake them separately, for whatever reason, the best reason would be, like in the case that I gave, you're making a birthday party, and there are many kids coming, and you want for them to come back with a piece of dough for them to bake challah for Shabbos at home. You're gonna gift it. You're gifting it. You know what the din is? Even though when you needed the dough, it was the shear, you're going to be exempt. And now the Mishnah will give you an exception to the rule. Nachtoim, when you have a baker, and he's not making your regular dough, but he's making a so'oir dough. Today, sourdough is very popular. But let's go back to the main purpose of so'oir dough was when people make bread and they want for the dough to properly rise, for it to become leavened, chametzik, prior to baking it, that's a process that takes time. Whoever made challah knows that. You have to let it rest, then it rises. If you want to expedite that, you put in that dough a piece of sourdough, and sourdough triggers everything, and it makes it become leavened quicker. So it was common that people bought sourdoughs. I
think today they call it a starter.
Starters, very good. And starters are little. So you have a baker. The baker made one large starter. Let's call it, in the words of the Mishnah, so'oid. The so'oid that the baker made had the share of 43.2 eggs. But he was never planning to sell it entirely. He's planning to bake it into, 10 pieces, 20 pieces, 30 pieces, whatever. Pieces that are much less than the share. In other words, so you would think he's exempt. So the Mishnah is machadesh. In this case, you're chayev b'challah. Why? Now, why? I'm going to jump ahead already. See the Marafulda, 10 lines before the bottom of the Amit to see the reason why. And now you see the chachma that was used to compile Talmud Yerushalmi. Because the logic that the Gemara gave, not the Mishnah, the Gemara gave, as Rabbi Yechanan put it before this Mishnah, that anything that you make to sell, you really don't know what the end will be. Same thing over here. That's the logic. Chayiv b'challah, says the Marafulda. Shedatoi, because in the mind of the baker, I'm selling. Guys, whoever's in business, of course you hope to sell. But what would happen if you're not going to sell? So you have a plan B. What's your plan B? That im lo yimatza koinim. The balabas, the nachlim has already in mind that if I won't find purchasers, you're not going to let it go to waste. Sheyaseno isa achas v'yo'afer kulak achas. He'll make a Shabbos dika chalodo, sourdough. It's not 100% that it's going to be broken into pieces. That's the logic behind this part of the Mishnah. Now we're going to go into the rule. What's the rule? The rule would be, again, is that if vadai, you're going to divide the dough prior to baking it, even though while you needed the dough, which is what triggers challah, you have the shear, but you know you're going to divide it into pieces, then you are exempt. How do you know you're going to divide it into pieces? So I gave an example where you're giving it as a gift, because by a gift, people are going to take a gift. It's not like you're selling it. You have to find someone to buy it. The Mishnah gives the following example. The noshim shenasnu lenachtoim lasis lahem so'ir. Women gave to a baker the raw materials for the baker to make their flour into sourdough, into a starter. So in other words, what did this baker do? Let's say 10 women gave him 4.32 egg amount volume of flour. 10 women each. He is not making 10 little sourdoughs. The baker has the right. He doesn't even have to consult with them, which he didn't. He gathered all of this together. Now he has the minimum share, and he made it into sourdough. But lachatchila doesn't belong to him. A tenth belongs to each woman. The noshim shenasnu lenachtim lasis lahem so'ir. So says the Mishnah that im ein b'shal achas v'hem kashir, if not a single one of these women gave the baker their own flour with the shear. No woman has the shear. Now the Gemara is going to do a lot with that. And if one has the shear and the other 9 don't, what will be? Let's leave that for the Gemara. But the Mishnah says when no one chelek has the shear, even though the flour was kneaded with water when the total had the shear, p'turim and achala, like we explained. Because here, vadai, they will not be baked together because the nachman doesn't bake it. You don't bake the starter. You give the dough / starter to its owner, and you're not even planning to sell it. It's not yours. Beautiful. Now, there is something called dog food.
In other words, the starter is one big blob and he's putting it in the black blob.
No, actually, it started out from 10 small blobs, and he put it together with the intent of redividing it. That's why you are exempt, because vada, you're going to divide it.
So what we gave the starter to
The baker who needed one big 5-pound knows that he's going to divide it into 10. The key is that when you knead the dough, you know that it will not be baked together. That's what's key. And then, even though when you kneaded it, it was the shear, you're exempt from chal. He's not baking anything in this case. He's giving it back to the woman. It will never be baked together. Now, moving on to the next case. Sometimes when it comes to Hilchas Kashrus versus Hilchas Pesach, this is connected to the Mishnah. We say, is it Roy Lachilas Adam or Ein Roy Lachilas Adam? Then other times, like for Pesach, for Chametz, even if Chametz is not Roy Lachilas Adam, it's still called Chametz. When does it become not Chametz? If prior to Pesach, it's not even Roy Lachilas Kelev. That's going to be very much. Now you'll appreciate that option, Aleph, option base, when you learn this mission. A dough that's being made to bake biscuits / food for dogs. Baked for dogs. So I want you to know that even if something is completely inedible for people, we're going to see in the Gemara, b'di'evet, for people not to starve, a person would eat something that's Michael Kelev. But that's unusual. But then there are certain dog foods that people eat from. And that's the case of the Mishnah. When you have an Isa that's made for Kelovim, if shepherds in that location customarily eat from this type of bread from the dough called Isas HaKlovim, even though most of it will be used for dogs, but it's something that it's not only in extreme circumstances because you're starving. No, shepherds eat from it. Why shepherds? I have no idea. I wonder how common or uncommon it is today for the animal lovers over here to eat their dog food. So like this. So here we go. This is the key. If shepherds eat from it, we classify that as human food. Here you see, in other words, just because Roy Lachilas Kelev, doesn't even mean it's not roi lachilas adam. It's roi lachilas adam. Some people eat from it. And look how many dinim are touched by the fact that halachically we view it as human food. Number one, you're chayiv and challah. In other words, if something is not edible, only under extreme circumstances, but it's not edible achilas adam, you are exempt from the obligation of challah. And here you're making it for dogs, isas haklavim. But the fact that shepherds allowed themselves to partake from it, we classify it as adam. So chayev is bechallah. You put two meals. You can use this. You can use a product. No one is putting the dough, just for the record. This dough is now baked into bread, into biscuits, into whatever. So you can make an eruv chatzeres. You can make a shituv mavois, umishtatfim ba. Umevarchim oleo. Mevarchim, let's go with the pshat that if someone eats it, they make a birchas hamazon because they ate the bona fide food. Or furthermore, if 3 Yidden ate this together, and you can say that they're ashamed to show they're eating dog food. But if people, the shepherds eat it together. So if 3 people ate it together, you can make a zimun. And by the way, making a zimun is not because 2 ate proper bread and 1 ate this. Even if all 3 men aviv ate this isas haklavim, that's called that they had a su'uda together and the chayv and zimun. And the nasas b'yomtiv, another thing. We know that on yomtiv you're allowed to cook food. But ach asher yeyochel l'chol nefesh hu levade yeyoseh lochem. 100%. I'm allowed to cook food on Shabbos. Chas v'shalom. I'm allowed to cook food on Yom Tov. But you know what? I can cook something that I will eat. Right? That's why when it comes to having a non-Jewish guest on Yom Tov, it's a problem. I'm not saying always. We have to see it because if you're making extra food for them, then you're not. Then there's no heter of oichel nefesh. And the same is true if it's not oichel adam. So says the Mishnah that if you're making isas haklavim, you're making it for your dog. But if bisman shehoroyim oichlin mimeno, that's okay because you're making food for you. Another thing, what happens if you make matzah from isas haklavim? A real dog lover. Shtel zechvar. Same thing. It's okay. How great is that? In other words, one thing is clear. You can only fulfill the obligation of eating matzah on Pesach if it's from a dough that's chayiv to have challah separated from it. Since it's chayiv and challah, you're yoitz. But v'im ein haroim oichlin mimeno. If shepherds don't eat from this isas haklavim, like I mentioned, even though there will always be circumstances where since it's roi lachilas kelev, if a person is starving, let's call this under extreme circumstances, a person would eat from it. It's not enough for this. It's not enough for this. To say that something is not chametz, but it's not food, for that, it has to be something that even under extreme circumstances you won't eat. That's called eino roi lachilas kelev. But if something is roi lachilas kelev, but people don't eat, then eina chayev b'chala. We're going through all of the dinim in the opposite direction. Ve'ein ma'arvim ba, ve'ein mishtatfim ba, ve'ein mevarchim aleh. Let's go. That's the meaning of hamoitzi. Ve'ein mezamenim aleh. And you cannot make it on Yom Tov. Your mamash, it's not. There's no heter of oichol nefesh. And ve'ein adam yoytze ba yedei chavasu bePesach. Period. Now says the Mishnah, benkach or benkach, meaning whether royim are able to eat from it, whether royim are unable to eat from it, even when shepherds don't eat from it. Like I mentioned, since under extreme circumstances, something that's roi lachilas kelev people will eat from. So there's one din in the Torah. I know we're not speaking about chametz and Pesach. I don't even know why. But the Mishnah will mention that we'll consider it human food. Tumas oichlin. Mitama with a chidik. Mitama tumas oichlin. Guys, whenever there's a shva, mitame means it conveys tuma. Whenever there's a chidik, it means it becomes tummy. It acquires tuma. This isas haklavim, even bisman she'ein haroyin oichlin ba. This is very important. The dinim of tuma and tara is a lot more sensitive. Emes that if it's not roy lachila at all, it's not subject to tumas oichlin. How can you call it tumas oichlin if people don't eat from it? But even if dogs eat from it, even if people never eat from it, it does acquire tuma. Why? Because under extreme circumstances, people will eat from it. That will be the exception. And I know that chametz is also an exception. Atkan the Mishnah, Chevra, we have enough time. Daf Yud Daled Amud Beis. And we are now beginning with the Gemara. And we quoted this case in our introduction. And this is mamish beautiful. So number one, then, when you have produce, any produce, when is it called tevel, gomer? When is it that you can't even rabbinically snack from it? When it became completed, when its processing is completed. That's called gemar melacha. By the 5 grains that you're planning to sell in the market, let's just add that. When does it undergo its gemar melacha? By the meiruach. Not enough that you threshed it. When you smooth the pile on the threshing floor. Whatever was called in that place, completed. The question now will be, what happens if some chacham decides to do his fellow a favor? You know, what did they say in English? That the road to hell is paved with good intentions. No, good intention. I want to help you. But what did I do? I smoothed your pile of grain. Little did I know that by me doing that, I might have made your life complicated, because once something has a gemar melacha, it's done. Now it's tevel. Now the owner had no such intent. The owner had no such desire. So is it nitbal or loy nitbal? Machloikes Rabbi Yochanan v'Reish Lakish. Hamimoreach kirish al chaveru shloi medatoi Rabbi Yochanan v'Rav Shimon ben Lakish. Rabbi Yochanan says nitbal. And Reish Lakish says loy nitbal. At the end of today's shir, I'll give a suggestion. I'll pi Chasidus. Why are they arguing? It's a very deep argument. But here we go. Why are we bringing this machlekes over here? Because the first attempted refutation of Shitas Rabbi Yochanan will come from our Mishnah. So Masiv Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish le Rabbi Yochanan says in our Mishnah, the Hataninon, that v'noshim shenosnu lenachtem lasis lahem so'oir. Here, again, the second case of the Mishnah, the rule where 10 women gave to the baker flour. The flour belongs to the women. They're paying him for the service of turning it into sourdough. Now, the Gemara, Reish Lakish's understanding of the Mishnah is not the way we explained it, which will be the answer of Rabbi Yochanan. It's going to be whether the women even agreed for their flour to be mixed with their fellow's flour. The Gemara's current understanding is that each woman gave to the baker their flour for it to be turned into sourdough. They wanted for the baker to only work with their dough separately. They didn't want their dough to be mixed with someone else's dough. In other words, how did you get to the shear? How did you get to the shear? Because the baker, without their das, mixed one with the other. And Rab Shlakish understands that the reason indeed why the baker is pater mechala is because he made it without their consent. In other words, mixing flour with water and adding flour up until the shear is tantamount to smoothing the pile, because smoothing the pile is the gemar melacha, which triggers the obligation of trumas u'maisros. Kneading the shear of flour with water triggers the obligation of challah. They're very similar. And in our Mishnah, it says that in ein b'shalachas v'em kishir p'turim en challah. Now says Reish Lakish ve'ein b'shal kulan kishir, but if you mix them all together, you do have the shear. And again, Reish Lakish's understanding of the Mishnah is that why are we exempt? Because the baker had no such consent from the owner, from the women, to mix flour one with the other. In other words, when you do something shaloi midas of the owner, what you did is not valid. Loi nitbal. So Amar Lei, Rabbi Yochanan tells Reish Lakish, no, you misunderstand our Mishnah. The reason why there is an exemption is not because the baker mixed the flour without their consent. Let me tell you, even if the woman befeidish gave the baker the consent, there is no obligation of removing challah. Why then? Because whenever you knead dough together, if it's clear that you will not be baking this into challah together, and I don't mean together, Aviv, that you have to put it in the oven at the same time. It's not even yours. You're giving it to different people. They're going to different places. You're completely dividing it. You are exempt. Shanya, our case is different. Even if you make a dough, almanas lachalka batzik, and you plan to divide it into small pieces, and you're going to gift it to other people. Or I'll tell you better, you're going to bake it yourself. You're going to bake a little bit this week, a little bit next week. Me'ikar adin, you're patur. That's why you are exempt. Beautiful. And now, today's final attempt to refute Rabbi Yochanan, Amalei, you're not done yet, challenges Reish Lakish against Rabbi Yochanan. How can you say, Says Rabbi Yechanan, I don't care intent. I care about bepoil mamish. You got the meruach. You have the gemar malacha. Rabbi Yechanan says, you're chayiv. It's called tevel. I got a problem. Vataninon. I'm sorry. With two more pieces. It says in the beginning part of the Mishnah, if a baker prepared sourdough in order to sell pieces to different women, you're chayiv in challah. Now, why are you chayiv in challah? Asks Reish Lakish to Rabbi Yechanan. If the reason why in the second case of the Mishnah you are pater, it's because whenever you make a dough, almenas lachalka, you plan to divide the dough prior to baking, you are exempt. So even in the first case, you should be exempt. Armalei answers Rabbi Yechanan, Loi tisveini nachtoim. Don't refute my understanding from the first case of the Mishnah of the baker, like we had in the Gemara today on Amud Aleph before the Mishnah. Nachtoim, a baker that plans to sell, Loi bedate hadavar talui. Well, will he actually sell it? Well, it depends if you have customers. Bedas halakuchais hadavar talui. And again, legirsas ha-Yerushalmi, shema yimtza lekuchais. You might find one purchaser that decides to buy all of the sourdough and to make all of it into a bread. One sourdough bread, like today, Dominic. Everyone has sourdough breads. The one buyer will make it into one isa. Or the nusach that we have in the Bavli is that shema lo yimtza lekuchais. You're not going to find any buyers. So you, the baker, will end up baking it all together. That's why you're chayiv and chalom. And now the final attempted refutation from Rabbi Yechanan against Reish Lakish, which is, we learned the Mishnah in Maaseh, if you find kernels of grain in an anthole, the question is, can you snack from it or not? What is that dependent on? If the ants took these grains from a smooth pile, from a pile that became tevel, then you can't even snack from it. If the ants took these kernels of grain from a pile that was not yet smooth, then you could snack from it. And the Mishnah gives a very simple rule. We look at the closest pile of grain near the ant hole. We don't say the ants are very expeditious, they're Gavaldika workers, but why would they do extra work? That's also not smart. They took it from the closest pile of grain. That if you have an antle, shalonu b'tzad ha'arema, that if they are near a pile of grain that's already nitbal, that had the meruach, then chayeves. Hare'elu chayav, and then these grains are presumed to have come from the closer pile. What does that imply? That if it came near a pile, if the closer pile was not yet smooth, pturin. Now, a bomb question. What's Gemar Malacha? You know what the Gemara is asking? Aviv, listen to this. When the ants put the kernels of grain in the ant hole, that is meruach. That's a final product. They gathered it together. I know they're animals, they're ants. So what? If you don't have to have das, AI, then the act of the ant should also be meruach. So you should always be chayiv in removing maisres. You should never be allowed to snack from it. So Rabbi Yechanan has a Gavaldic answer. He says it must be that the Mishnah is speaking about a case where the kernels that you find when they came from the pile are still in their shafts. So it's not a finished product, unless the owner smoothed it that way. Amar Rabbi Yoina, that Amar li Rabbi Yoisi, that Rababo b'shem Rabbi Yechanan. Answer number one is Mishum Yeush. Has nothing to do with Meruach or not. That's a simple way to resolve this. In other words, there's another din that anything that's hefker is not subject to tayes. So it has nothing to do, really, this whole Mishnah of from which pile it came from. That's a misunderstanding. It has to do with the fact the ants made a Gemar Malacha, but prior to the Gemar Malacha, it became hefker. That's the word. If something had a Gemar Malacha while it was ownerless, it's going to be exempt. So you don't need to have kavana to make a Gemar Malacha, but it still will not be mechayev. It won't trigger the obligation. Daf Tezvav, just one more line. Shmuel bar Abba gives another answer. That the case must be that they dragged these kernels and they had still some husks on them, and that's why there is no Gemar Malacha. Now I want to just say one gavaldik word. Rabbi Yechanan and Reish Lakish, which is something that the Rebbe suggests. Rabbi Yechanan is a tzaddik. He represents the tzaddik. Reish Lakish, Kiyadua, represents the Baal Tshuva. Now, we know that Hamaisa Hua Ikar Aviv. What counts? What you do. But for a Baal Tshuva, they can't go with what counts is what you do. You know why? Because they did things that are not okay. How do you do tshuva? With kavana. You can't undo what you did. But when you feel such a remorse, and that remorse you're channeling to do greater mitzvahs, so even though the act in the past was unholy, it becomes transformed into something holy. Which is why Reish Lakish will give more chashivus to kavana. And Rabbi Yochanan doesn't need the kavana. The actions are always good. Perhaps. And that's why Rabbi Yochanan says we only look at what you did. And Reish Lakish also wants to know what the intention is. To be